Help in Pharmaceuticals in association with Higher Secondary Principals Forum.
Good day, students. I am teacher Manisha Naik Udaikar of Shiroda High Secondary School, and today for this session I shall be dealing with chapter number 7, the interview by Christopher Sylvester from the prose section of your Flamingo textbook. Dear students, if I ask you, who is your role model? Whom do you admire in your life? I am sure I am going to get different answers. Some of you may like people from the field of entertainment, sports, literature, science, and so on. Well, when we admire someone, we want to know more about them, their lives and their success stories. It is not possible for every one of us to enter their space, and therefore we tend to read about them, listen to their interviews. So today, from this chapter, we are going to learn how interview is a very important segment in the field of journalism. This is an excerpt taken from the Penguin Book of Interviews edited by Christopher Sylvester. Let us have a look at the profile of Christopher Sylvester. Christopher Sylvester is a freelance journalist, author and consultant who writes for several UK newspapers and magazines. He was born in London in 1959 and studied history at the University of Cambridge. He worked for many years as a reporter for the satirical magazine Private Eye and has written for various American publications, including The Spy, The New York Observer, Vanity Fair, and The New Yorker. He is also the editor of the Norton Book of Interviews, and he lives in London. The interview, the lesson we are going to learn today, is an excerpt taken from his introduction to the Penguin Book of Interviews, an anthology from 1859 to the present day. Your chapter interview is divided into two parts. In part 1, we are going to look at the functions, merits, demerits, and methods of interview. We are also going to look at the viewpoints of different novelists and writers on interview. Part 2 is an extract from an interview with the author Umberto Eco. Before we actually start with the lesson, students, you need to know the meanings of these two words. Interviewer, the person who takes an interview is called an interviewer. The person who gives an interview is called as interviewee. So part 1 of the interview lesson starts with the introduction to the interview as a commonplace of journalism since its invention, which was a little over 130 years ago. So here we are told that since its invention, which was a little over 130 years ago, since then interview has become a very commonplace in journalism. Today, everyone must have read an interview, seen an interview at some point in their life, whereas from the other point of view, several celebrities have been interviewed, some of them repeatedly. Therefore, it is not difficult to understand that different people have different views on interview. So today we are going to look at some of the viewpoints. Some people feel that interview is the highest form of journalism. They feel that it is the source of truth because we can extract true incidences, we can know about the people in public domain. Some people also feel that it is an art because the interviewer should master the art of extracting the material from the interviewee. He should be very versatile in asking questions because he should be able to get answers from the interviewee. Whereas there are other category of people, especially celebrities who feel that they are victims of the interview. And why they feel so? Because they feel that interview is an unwarranted intrusion into their life. Now, what do you mean by unwarranted intrusion? Unwarranted intrusion means uninvited intervention into their life. Therefore, they despise the interview. They hate interviews. They also feel that it diminishes them. They feel that giving an interview diminishes them, lowers their star persona, because they feel that their privacy is invaded. Just as in some primitive cultures, it is believed that if one takes a photographic portrait of somebody, then one is stealing that person's soul. Just in some olden cultures, it is believed that when you make perceptions about someone, you are actually stealing that person's original identity. That is why celebrities do not like to give an interview, because they feel that the readers and the viewers are going to have an impression about them, and thereby they are going to lose their original identity. We are also going to look at the viewpoints given by different novelists and authors on interview. V.S. Naipaul, Lewis Carroll, Rudyard Kipling, H.G. Wells and Saul Bellow. V.S. Naipaul, Sir Vidya Suraj Prasad Naipaul, was a Trinidad-born British writer of Indian origin who has written works of fiction and non-fiction in English. He is also the receiver of Nobel Prize in Literature in the year 2001. Now, he feels that some people are wounded by interview and lose a part of themselves. So, V.S. Naipaul is of the opinion that when people give an interview, they permanently lose a part of themselves, and that is why they feel hurt for lifetime. Lewis Carroll, English writer of children's fiction and the creator of Alice in Wonderland. I am sure you must have seen the beautiful movie Alice in Wonderland. The writer of that book is Lewis Carroll. He seems to have had a horror of the interviewer. He got scared of the interviewer, and therefore he never consented to be interviewed. He never gave permission to take an interview. He never gave an interview. What type of horror he had? He had the horror of being lionized. Now, what do you mean by lionized? Lionized means, made into a big celebrity, controlled, and you are made to answer certain questions which celebrities sometimes do not want to answer. Therefore, he would just keep these people away from him. And later, Lewis Carroll narrated incidences in how he managed to avoid and silence these people, would-be interviewers, petitioners for his autograph, people who would come to ask for his autograph. He would just keep them away. Rudyard Kipling, Joseph Rudyard Kipling, was an English journalist, short story writer, poet and novelist. He is famous for children's classic The Jungle Book. You must have seen this movie, students. He is also known as the poet of common soldiers. Rudyard Kipling, the writer of The Jungle Book, has a very condemnatory attitude towards the interviewer. His wife, Caroline, wrote in her diary for 14th October 1892 that the entire day was wrecked means spoiled, by two reporters from Boston. He feels that an interview is immoral, it is a crime and an assault, an attack which deserves punishment, which should be punished. He also feels that it is cowardly. Cowardly means lacking in courage, and vile means very low in standard. Therefore, he is of the opinion that no respectable man would ever ask for it and no respectable man would ever give it. But ironically, Kipling had himself perpetrated means committed such type of assault on Mark Twain only a few years ago before giving this statement. Now, Mark Twain is an American writer and very famous American humorist. H.G. Wells, an English novelist, journalist, sociologist, known for his work of science fictions like The Time Machine, The Invisible Man, The War of the Worlds. He once said that giving an interview is really an unpleasant experience. He calls interviewing an ordeal, unpleasant experience. But 40 years later, he interviewed Joseph Stalin, the dictator of USSR. We next have the viewpoint of Saul Bellow. He is the Canadian-American writer. Most of his works were widely influenced by World War II. He is also the winner of Nobel Prize in Literature in the year 1976. He consented to be interviewed on several occasions. He gave interview on several occasions. But once he said that giving an interview was like thumbprint on his windpipe. Now, what do you mean by this expression, thumbprint on the windpipe? When you place a finger on the throat of a person, you are actually suffocating that person, choking that person. So, he went through same kind of feeling when he was actually giving an interview. That is why he uses this beautiful expression to put forward his feelings. He says, he describes interview as thumbprint on his windpipe. Nevertheless, students, we have known different viewpoints given by different celebrities. But Christopher Sylvester, the editor of this excerpt, feels that interview is a supremely serviceable medium of communication. He feels that interview is very, very powerful in the field of journalism because it is supremely serviceable medium of communication. He also feels that it is the source of truth, and we can get vivid impressions of our contemporaries, clear impressions of our contemporaries. Now, contemporaries means people living in the same time period. He even quotes Dennis Bryan. Dennis Bryan is a journalist and author of many books, notably a 1996 biography, Einstein Alive. Dennis Bryan has written, almost everything of a moment reaches out to the world by one man asking questions to the another. So, he says, everything, almost everything of moment reaches us through one man asking questions of another. And because of this, the interviewer holds a position of unprecedented power and influence. So, he says, because of this, the interviewer has a very important role and he holds a very, very influential status in an interview. So, with this, we come to an end with part 1 of the interview lesson. We move on to part 2, which is actually an extract from an interview of Umberto Eco, Italian novelist and semiotician, published on Sunday 23rd October 2005 on the Hindu newspaper. Interviewer is Mukund Padmanabhan, the editor of the Hindu newspaper, and interviewee is Umberto Eco. So, on the screen you can see Mukund Padmanabhan, the editor of the Hindu newspaper, and on the other side you can actually see the newspaper Hindu, an English language daily owned by the Hindu group which has its headquarters at Chennai. I am a professor who writes novels on Sundays, Umberto Eco. Umberto Eco was born on 5th January 1932 and died on 19 February 2016. Umberto Eco, a professor at the University of Bologna, had already acquired a formidable reputation as a scholar for his ideas on semiotics. Now, semiotics is study of signs and symbols. Literary interpretation, that is evaluation of literary texts, and medieval aesthetics. Now medieval aesthetics means, medieval means relating to the Middle Ages, and aesthetics means general philosophy of beauty during that time. So he had already acquired a very powerful status in all these fields before he turned to writing fiction. In the year 1980, he became very famous and acquired intellectual superstardom with his debut novel, The Name of the Rose, which sold for more than 10 million copies. Before we move forward to the actual interview, which is taken by Mukund Padmanabhan, we need to know two meanings of two important words here: fiction, literature in the form of prose, especially novels that describes imaginary events and people. Fiction is literature or prose which describes imaginary people or events, whereas non-fiction is prose writing that is very informative and factual based on the facts. From here on, the actual interview starts. The English novelist and academic David Lodge once remarked, "I can't understand how one man can do all the things that he does." To that, Umberto Eco replies, "Maybe I give the impression of doing so many things, but in the end, I am convinced that I am doing the same thing." So he says, maybe people feel that Umberto Eco is doing so many things. He is writing fiction, he is writing academic texts, he is into semiotics and so many things. And that is why they feel how one man can do so many things. To that he says, maybe I give the impression, people feel that I do many things, but in the end I am convinced that I am doing the same thing. Which is, so Mukund asks him, which is, now that is more difficult to explain. So he says, now that is more difficult to explain. I have some philosophical interests and I pursue them through novels. Even my books for children are about non-violence and peace. You see, the same bunch of ethical, philosophical interests. So he says, it is very difficult to explain what is that one thing. But you see, I have some interest in philosophy. That is what Eco says. He says, I have some interest in philosophy and I try to pursue that interest through my novels. Even my books for children are about non-violence and peace. So you see, same bunch of ethical, philosophical interest. And then he says, I have a secret. Did you know what will happen if you eliminate the empty spaces in all the atoms? The universe will become as big as my fist. So Umberto Eco comes to an interesting point wherein he explains interesting fact about his life. He says, do you know what is going to happen if we try to eliminate, remove all the spaces from the atoms? In your science, you must have learnt molecular chain and spaces in the molecular chain. So when you remove all the spaces from an atom, the entire universe, he says, is going to become as big as my fist. Similarly, he says, we have a lot of empty spaces in our life. Similarly, human life is full of empty spaces and I call them interstices. He uses this word interstice, which means gaps or spaces. So he uses this to let us know that he utilizes his time in a very productive way. And which is that time? The gaps. Now I am going to explain to you what exactly interstice is. For example, suppose you have finished your English class and you are waiting for your next teacher of the next subject to come. So the time period between your English class and the next teacher's arrival is an interstice, the gap, the space. So he says, I use such type of spaces, gaps, to do productive work. He goes on to explain in his words what is an interstice. Say you are coming over to my place. You are in an elevator, and while you are coming up, I am waiting for you. This is an interstice, an empty space. I work in empty spaces. While waiting for your elevator to come up from the first to the third floor, I have already written an article. So he says, he gives an example. He says, suppose you are coming over to my place on the third floor. I am waiting for you on the third floor. You are in an elevator. By the time your elevator reaches from the first floor to the third floor, that time period wherein I am waiting for you is actually an interstice. So during that time, he says, I have already written an article. To that, Mukund says, not everyone can do that, of course. Your non-fictional writing, your scholarly work has a certain playful and personal quality about it. He goes on to the next question. He says, not everyone can work in interstices. Your non-fictional work, that is your academic work, your essays, your children's book and other work has a certain playful and personal quality about it. Means you have given a personal touch to your writings. It is marked departure from a regular academic style which is invariably depersonalized and often dry and boring. So he says, your work has personal touch to it, which is totally different from regular academic writing, which are depersonalized, which do not have personal touch and often dry and boring. Have you consciously adopted an informal approach, or is it something that just came naturally to you? Have you done it purposely, or it is just natural way of writing? Umberto Eco replies to this question and he says, when I presented my first doctoral dissertation in Italy. Now doctoral dissertation is when you pursue your PhD, you are supposed to study on a particular subject of your choice and then come out with a long piece of writing based on your study on that subject. So when you present that long piece of writing, that is called as doctoral dissertation. When I presented my first doctoral dissertation in Italy, one of the professors said, scholars learn a lot about the subject. Then they make a lot of false hypotheses. Then they correct them and at the end, they put their conclusions. Now, hypothesis means assumptions which are made at the beginning of the study, at the initial stage of the study. So he says, there are many scholars who put the hypothesis, then they correct it or they change it. You on the contrary narrated the story of your research. When you were presenting your doctoral dissertation, you presented the story of your research. What exactly happened from day one to the time when you actually ended with your dissertation or your work, your research. So including your trials and errors. Even including, he says, your trials and errors. At the same time, he recognized I was right and went on to publish my dissertation as a book, which meant he appreciated it. So Umberto Eco tells Mukund that he said all these things, that I narrated the story of my research, but later he went on to publish my dissertation as a book, which meant he liked it. At that point, at the age of 22, I understood scholarly books should be written the way I had done, by telling the story of the research. So Umberto Eco tells Mukund that at the age of 22, when I presented my doctoral dissertation, at that time I understood that scholarly works have to be written the way I had done, by narrating the story of the research. This is why my essays always have a narrative aspect. That is why even my essays, academic essays, always have a narrative aspect. And this is why I did not feel the urge of writing novels. And that is why he says I started writing novels very late, that is at the age of 50. Because my academic essays, my academic text satisfied my taste for narration. He moves forward. He says, I remember that my dear friend Ronald Barthes, now Ronald Barthes is French literary theorist, essayist, philosopher and a semiotician like Umberto Eco. He was always frustrated that he was an essayist and not a novelist. So Umberto Eco tells Mukund that, I remember my dear friend Ronald Barthes was always frustrated, he was not happy that he is an essayist and not a novelist. He wanted to do creative writing one day or the other, but he died before he could do so. I, on the other hand, he says, never felt this kind of frustration. I started writing novels by accident. One day, I did not have anything to do, and so I started writing novels. Novels, he says, probably satisfy my taste for narration. Moving forward, Mukund asks him about the novels. He says, talking about novels, from being a very famous academic, you went to becoming even spectacularly famous after the publication of The Name of the Rose. So he says, first you were very famous as an academic and a semiotician. Later, with the publication of The Name of the Rose, you went on to become spectacularly famous as a novelist. The Name of the Rose, you have written 5 novels against many more scholarly works of non-fiction, at least more than 20 of them. So he says, you have written just 5 novels, but more than 20 non-fictional works, scholarly works. And to that, Umberto Eco corrects him and he says, over 40. Over 40. Among them, a seminal, influential piece of work on semiotics. I already told you the meaning of the word semiotics. It is the study of signs and symbols. Among them, he says, a seminal piece of work on semiotics. But ask most people about Umberto Eco and they will say, oh, he's the novelist. Does that bother you? So Mukund asks him that you have written over 40 non-fictional work and just 5 novels. But if you ask people about Umberto Eco and they will say, oh, he's the novelist, does that bother you? Yes, because I consider myself as a university professor who writes novels on Sundays. So he says, yes, it does bother me because I am a professor who writes novels only on Sundays. It's not a joke. I participate in academic conferences and not meetings of pen clubs and writers. So he says, I associate myself with the teachers community. I do not participate in the meetings of pen clubs. Now pen club is an association of worldwide writers which is based in London. So he says, I do not take part in meetings of pen clubs, rather I take part in academic conferences. I consider myself as professor who writes novels only on Sundays. I identify myself with academic community, he says. But okay, if they, that is most people, have read only the novels, he says, it's okay if they know me as a novelist because I expect that more people read novels rather than stuff on semiotics. I reach a large audience. I cannot expect to have 1 million readers with stuff on semiotics. So he says, by writing novels, I am able to reach vast audience, large number of people, which I cannot do by my works on semiotics. Which brings me to my next question. The Name of the Rose is a very serious novel. It is a detective yarn at one level, but it also delves into metaphysics, theology and medieval history. Yet, it enjoyed a huge mass of audience. Were you puzzled at all by this? So Mukund asks him, which brings me to my next question, speaking about the novels. I want to know more about your novel, The Name of the Rose, which has a detective story, which also has an element of metaphysics. Now, metaphysics is a branch of philosophy which deals with the nature of existence. It also deals, he says, your novel also deals with theology, that is study of nature of God, and medieval history, history relating to the Middle Ages. Yet, it enjoyed huge mass audience. It was enjoyed by n number of people. Were you surprised by the success of your own novel? He says. And to that Umberto says, no, journalists were puzzled and sometimes the publishers. And this is because journalists and publishers believe that people like to read only thresh. Thresh means easy reading experiences, simple books, simple reading experiences, and do not like difficult reading experiences. He says, consider there are 6 billion people on this planet. The Name of the Rose sold between 10 and 15 million. So, in a way, I reached only a small percentage of readers. But this is the same category of people who do not like to have easy reading experiences, or maybe not always. He goes on to give his own example. He says, I myself at 9 p.m. after dinner like to watch television shows like Miami Vice or Emergency Room. I enjoy it, but not all day. So likewise, he says, people sometimes want to read easy books, but not every time. Could the huge success of the novel have anything to do with the fact that it dealt with a period of medieval history that? So Mukund asks him the next question. Could the success of your novel, The Name of the Rose, be associated with the fact that it dealt with the medieval history? Umberto says, well, that's possible. But let me tell you another story, because I often tell stories like Chinese wise men. My American publisher said, while she loved my book, liked the book Name of the Rose, but she did not assure him that it is going to be bought by the people in America. And therefore, she gave the advance money of 3,000 copies to him. She said she loved my book, but she didn't expect to sell more than 3,000 copies in a country where nobody has seen a cathedral or studies Latin. So, I was given an advance of 3,000 copies, but in the end, it sold 2 or 3 million in the US. A lot of books, he says, have been written about the medieval past far before mine. I think the success of this book is a mystery. Had I written this book 10 years earlier or 10 years later, it would not have been so successful. Why The Name of the Rose was a successful novel during that time, he says, is still a mystery. So with this, we come to an end with part 2 of the lesson, that is the actual interview between Mukund and Umberto Eco. Just to have a recap of what we learned in part 1 and part 2. In part 1 of the lesson, we learned interview as a communication genre, that is a stylistic category of literature. We also learned about different opinions given by different people from the field of literature. We also learned about pros and cons of the interview, how people have positive viewpoints as well as negative viewpoints regarding the interview. In part 2, we learned Umberto Eco's writing style, how he manages time. We also came to know a lot of things about his novel, The Name of the Rose, how linkers and signalers like that, this, Same thing, repetition of words from question to the answer, how question is linked to the answer and how linkers from the answer are used to frame the next question. Without the linkers and signalers, the flow of ideas in a conversation will not be smooth and continuous. So therefore, in an interview, linkers and signalers are very, very important. We move on to the questions which would be appearing for your Goa board paper for 2 marks, which you are supposed to write from 20 to 25 words. Questions like, what are some of the views on interview? You are supposed to write. What are the viewpoints on interview given by different people? Only thing you should keep in mind is you do not exceed the word limit. Next question is, why do celebrities dislike being interviewed? What they feel, why they are uncomfortable in giving an interview. The next one, give any 2 demerits of being interviewed. What are the demerits of giving an interview? That is what you are supposed to write for 2 marks. How did Umberto Eco make the best possible use of interstices in his life? How did Umberto Eco make the best possible use of spaces in his life? You can write the answer as he used this time in productive writing, writing novels, writing articles and so on. But 2 points for 2 marks. Why did being called a novelist bother Umberto Eco? Answer to this question is very easy, because he considers himself as a university professor who writes novels only on Sundays, and he has 40 non-fictional works against just 5 novels, but still people know him as a novelist. And why does that bother him? On this slide you will get all the new words which we have come across in part 1. On the other side you are going to get the meanings of all those words. Please do refer when you are reading your text. With this, I end this session of mine. Hope that you are going to read your text for the better understanding of this session. Thank you very much.
Prudent Scholars, powered by Lupin Pharmaceuticals.
अब आपकी सुरक्षा आपके हाथों में। ल्यूपी सेफ हैंड सैनिटाइजर, आपका और चेन्नई सुपर किंग्स का फर्स्ट लाइन ऑफ डिफेंस। अब आपकी सुरक्षा आपके हाथों में। ल्यूपी सेफ हैंड सैनिटाइजर, आपका और चेन्नई सुपर किंग्स का फर्स्ट लाइन ऑफ डिफेंस। अब आपकी सुरक्षा आपके हाथों में। ल्यूपी सेफ हैंड सैनिटाइजर, आपका और चेन्नई सुपर किंग्स का फर्स्ट लाइन ऑफ डिफेंस।